Good evening and welcome. I'm Sally Pierce, Curator of Prints and Photographs, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight Carol Bundy, who will speak to us about Charles Russell Lowell, Jr., a person who engaged with great personal commitment in the most compelling issues of his and public debates of his time and place. These were the issues of slavery in the United States and ultimately of national union. Carol Bundy is a biographer. She has written for film and art periodicals in the UK and also the US. And she is a proprietor of the Boston Athenaeum, and I'm happy to say that she did some of her research here. Charles Russell Lowell, Jr. is her great-great-great-uncle, and she became interested in him when his worn saddlebags, rusted sword, and spurs came to light after her grandmother's death in 1984. The result of her investigation is a new book, The Nature of Sacrifice, a biography of Charles Russell Lowell, Jr. Please join me in welcoming Carol Bundy.
Good evening. It's strange to be on the other side. I'm used to being in the audience, not up here. And I tried to think of what to say as an introduction, and the problem was really where to end. Doing the research here, and so many parts of this book took place within a block or two or three of this building, and so I'm not really going to go there. It would never end. So without further ado, I'll begin. Colonel Charles Russell Lowell was born in 1835 and killed in October 1864 at the Battle of Cedar Creek in the Shenandoah Valley. A disciple of Ralph Waldo Emerson, Lowell argued at his Harvard commencement in 1854 that the value of young men was not their physical labor, but their fresh ideals. Out of their dreams would come new realities. 10 years later, he died, as so many young men have died, serving their country, commanding a Union Cavalry Brigade alongside George Armstrong Custer, and displaying a pragmatism and courage that astonished even the most hard-bitten professional officers. In the crucible of civil war, Lowell's idealism was tested by bitter truths and starkest realities. Tempered and thus refined, he became the transcendental cavalier. Lowell believed the world advanced by impossibilities achieved. He was thinking of his maternal grandfather, Patrick Tracy Jackson, the founder of the city of Lowell, who had harnessed water power and made a fortune as the leading pioneer in the American textile industry. He was thinking of his father, Charles Russell Lowell Sr., who had tried to be the first American to smelt iron and had gone bankrupt in the attempt. Lowell was thinking of the railroad, reducing a 3-week journey to 3 days. He also meant the eradication of slavery, for he was the third generation in his family to oppose the institution. His paternal grandfather, the Reverend Charles Lowell, was one of the very few Boston ministers who spoke out against slavery. Lowell's uncle James Russell Lowell's ambition took a more literary and political line. He was the editor of the Anti-Slavery Standard, and his own poem, Bigelow Papers, gave voice to New England's opposition to the South's expansionist war with Mexico. And then the rancorous national fight over the spoils of that war, which resulted in the Compromise of 1850 with its notorious Fugitive Slave Law. In 1854, when Charlie Lowell watched the fugitive slave Anthony Burns march down to board ship and return to bondage, He was convinced that his parents' generation had failed. To them, the slave remained property. Only a new generation, his own, for whom the slave's humanity was foremost, would have the will to abolish slavery. Through the 1850s, Lowell was tempted to dedicate himself to the struggle, but he resisted. Committed to recouping the family fortune, he made a brilliant start in the iron business. Then tuberculosis struck, and Lowell spent 2 years convalescing in Europe. He toured the galleries of Rome with Nathaniel Hawthorne. He became an accomplished horseman, learning to use a saber in North Africa. Once well enough, he resumed his career, this time in the boom town of Burlington, Iowa, which overlooked the Mississippi River, as the treasurer of the fledgling Burlington, Missouri, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. 2 years in the Midwest building a business and observing the birth of the Republican Party did much to sober his politics. As he came to understand the economic realities of industrialization, he recognized that the slave economy had a limited lifespan. By 1860, when he returned east to become manager of an iron foundry in western Maryland, his plan was to spend 10 years in business, making enough money to then devote himself to public service. It was not to be. Lincoln's election, which he wholeheartedly supported, was the catalyst for secession. Although Lowell was in New Orleans when Louisiana seceded, he doubted anything so dramatic as war would occur. He did not respond to Lincoln's call for troops after the firing on Fort Sumter, and it was only by coincidence that he was in Baltimore on April 19, 1861, when an angry mob attacked Massachusetts volunteers as they changed trains for Washington. This attack and the spilling of Massachusetts blood motivated Lowell to go directly to Washington and apply for a commission in the regular army. The rest of his short life was in uniform. Awaiting his commission, Lowell worked as the agent for Massachusetts troops, seeing at firsthand how confused and chaotic the mobilization effort was. Commissioned a captain in the 6th U.S. Cavalry, he became friends with many of the young West Point officers who would later be the making of the Union Cavalry. During the Peninsula Campaign in the spring of 1862, he became an aide-de-camp to General George McClellan and served at Antietam, where he earned the coveted honor of delivering the captured battle flags to the Secretary of War. While these early experiences would prove invaluable later in the war, they were not immediately satisfying. The cavalry was not properly used. McClellan was a master planner, but hesitant in action. As a regular officer appointed to a staff position, Lowell spent long months recruiting, training, organizing, and supplying troops, while his friends in the volunteer army were fighting and dying. In April 1861, Lowell had predicted that volunteers would be food for cannon, but he had no idea of the emotional impact of that truth until October 1861, when his cousin, William Lowell Putnam, was killed at Ball's Bluff. On July 4th, 1862, his brother, James Jackson Lowell, died in enemy hands of wounds received at Glendale. On August 9th, at Cedar Mountain, a good portion of his childhood companions were killed, among them Richard Goodwin, so ill that only with the help of his servant was he able to march to battle. And hardly had he reached the front when both he and his servant were killed, neither having actually fought. Richard Carey, a member of the Lowell's childhood gang on Temple Court, round the corner from here, was also tubercular. James Savage was a Christian abolitionist, a man of searing rectitude, universally admired, adored by his men. He had been the leader of Lowell's childhood comrades, the hero of the snowball fight between the Beacon Street cowards and the newcomers on the Common, as recounted in the Education of Henry Adams by that junior member of the gang. Most traumatic was the death of Stephen Perkins. Shot 3 times in the head, Perkins had had a kind of Grecian beauty. Lowell and Perkins had crossed the Alps together, exhilarated by traversing glaciers and debating the meaning of life. It was Perkins who had posed the question, "I wonder whether we shall go on constantly expecting life to unfold itself and the great possibilities to appear in us and outside of us until we are surprised that death has come for us, when we hardly seem to ourselves to have lived." It is the question that Henry James turned into the short story, The Beast in the Jungle. At Second Bull Run, his cousin Warren Dutton died, and at Antietam, among many others, William Sedgwick and Wilder Dwight. Those at home saw these men as heroes and martyrs. Lowell was more conscious of the errors and sloppiness that contributed to their deaths. A redoubled sense of obligation went hand in hand with resolve to help make the Army an effective and disciplined fighting force. His opportunity came in late 1862 when he went back to Boston to raise, train, and command the 2nd Massachusetts Cavalry. And he began his intimate association with the 3 principles behind the Massachusetts war effort. Governor John Albion Andrew, a radical Christian evangelical abolitionist from Maine, the China trade merchant John Murray Forbes, a man of astounding enterprise, and the textile magnate Amos Adams Lawrence. Lowell became involved in the creation of the 54th Infantry, which his friend Robert Gould Shaw commanded. Over the winter of 1862-63, the 2 regiments, one white, one black, trained together. Lowell became engaged to Shaw's sister Josephine, known as Effie. They were a charmed couple at the forefront of the war's turn from a fight to restore the Union to the larger and radical objective of emancipation. This photograph is one I'm particularly proud of. It was only recently uncovered by David Gregg, who I'm afraid isn't here tonight, but it is remarkable because it is as close to a snapshot as you could get in 1863. Taken at a training camp, Camp Meigs out at Reedville, this represents the aristocracy of the abolitionist war effort. From left, in the rear, there's William Hathaway Forbes, Lewis Cabot, Henry Sturgis Russell, and Robert Gould Shaw. Sitting in front of them is Ida Agassiz, who married Henry Lee Higginson, the 2 Forbes sisters, Alice and Mary, who married Henry Sturgis Russell that spring, and the 2 Emerson girls, Ellen and Edith, who married William Hathaway Forbes after the war, and Annie Russell, who married Alexander Agassiz. By the summer of 1863, Lowell had returned to the front, and his war had turned nasty. The victory at Gettysburg was tempered by more deaths, most intimately his classmate Paul Revere, grandson of the Revolutionary Rider, his cousins Samuel Storrow and Sumner Payne. Then came news of the senseless slaughter of the 54th Regiment at Fort Wagner outside Charleston, South Carolina, in mid-July. Lowell's cousin, Cabot Russell, was missing, last seen on the ramparts with Shaw. And it was Robert Gould Shaw's heroic death that had the greatest impact on Lowell. The accumulated guilt of surviving when so many of his nearest friends and relations had not crystallized as Lowell struggled to console his wife over the loss of her brother. He developed an almost mystical sense of personal mission. From a base in Vienna, Virginia, he began a 10-month struggle to counter guerrilla operations in Virginia, specifically to foil and defeat John Singleton Mosby and his partisan Rangers, the swashbuckling heroes of Confederate lore. But from Lowell's perspective, this was inglorious warfare. His men called it police work. Mosby fought rough. Like most guerrillas, his strength lay in breaking every rule and convention regarding war. Ambushes were constant, and in 2 instances, devastating for the regiment. Favored officers killed, large numbers of men taken prisoner, and for those who survived, the experience of humiliating defeat in an unfair fight. Lowell tried to fight fair, constrained not only by his own sense of decency, but also by General Order 100, or Lieber's Code. This seminal document was the first attempt to codify the rules of war as they concerned civilians. The base document from which the Geneva Conventions were drawn, the cornerstone of our understanding of humanitarian law. Even thus constrained, Lowell was more successful fighting Mosby than any other Union commander. Twice he wounded him, but could not kill the elusive guerrilla leader. Time and again, Mosby and his men disappeared into the care of Virginia farmers, and these same farmers harassed and reported on every move Lowell made. Under such pressure, the regiment suffered more than its share of low morale. That winter, one of the coldest on record, desertion was rife. In February, a scouting party was ambushed by Mosby's men. During the skirmish, an outraged sergeant recognized the man shooting at him, a deserter from his own company, and promptly captured him. Brought into camp, the unfortunate youth was, at Lowell's orders, tried immediately by a drumhead court-martial and executed at dawn the following day before the assembled regiment. A summary execution only 16 miles from Washington was exceptional, even in this case when treason was the additional and graver offense. Lowell submitted to his superiors a complete record of the court-martial hearing and stated frankly that he had ordered and carried out the execution. He expected to be court-martialed, but his report was buried by his superiors. Even more extraordinary, the condemned man used his final words to support Lowell's order for his own execution. In August 1864, Lowell and his regiment gladly left behind Mosby and guerrilla warfare for the Cavalry Corps in the newly organized Middle Military Department, destined for the Second Shenandoah Valley Campaign under General Sheridan. The objective was to defeat the forces of General Jubal Early and drive the Confederates out of their stronghold, sanctuary, and source of supply, the Shenandoah Valley. If he succeeded, the noose around Lee's main army would tighten and the end be near. If he failed, the Confederates might hold out much longer, and in the face of the gathering voice for peace at any price in the North, might gain their independence. Lowell and his men soon learned that much of the ugliness they had assumed was unique to guerrilla action was now pervasive. Grant substantially altered military objectives when he ordered Sheridan's cavalry to pursue a scorched earth policy, destroying civilian resources. At the height of the harvest, in some of the nation's most fertile and beautiful countryside, the orders to burn were repugnant. Army policy towards civilians was further complicated when Mosby carried his guerrilla activity into the Shenandoah Valley. Despite Lowell's scrupulous attitude, he and his men were at the heart of the Front Royal Affair, one of the best documented atrocities of the Civil War, in which Union officers tortured and killed at least 6 prisoners. Sheridan, a trained infantry commander, was responsible for the strategic breakthrough in the use of cavalry. No longer simply tacked on to various infantry forces as scouts, it was used as a massed assault weapon of deadly and omnipotent force. The casualty rate soared, Lowell's talents were recognized, and he was promoted to command the Reserve Brigade of regular cavalry, General Buford's old command. In this capacity, he was in the thickest of the fighting at Winchester and then at Tom's Brook, popularly known as the Woodstock Races, because of a 30-mile chase of fleeing Confederates. Victory had become destruction, and to experience destruction on this scale, even at the destroyer, was transformative. Through this period, Lowell had the close support of his wife, Effie, who, after their marriage in October 1863, came to live with him at his headquarters, caring for the wounded and establishing a small school for the refugee ex-slaves who collected at the encampment. In late July 1864, 4 months pregnant, she returned home. Their almost daily correspondence until his death is a remarkable record. Lowell felt free to discuss politics, military policy, and the moral ambiguity of his difficult decisions. Many of the letters discuss their life after the war, the anticipated birth of their child, Lowell's desire to survive. He also wrote to his friends who were now out of the war. The only one from his family, from his childhood gang, from his Harvard class still fighting, Lowell accepted that his fate was to fight for all of them. To his surviving friends, men like Greeley Curtis and Charles Francis Adams, friends from the Boston Latin School, or Frank Barlow, also a protege of Emerson, who proved an even better general than Lowell, but had broken down at news of his wife's death from yellow fever. As a nurse, she had twice saved his life. Or Oliver Wendell Holmes, his much younger and adoring cousin, who later became the legendary Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And his closest cousin and best friend, Henry Lee Higginson, who subsequently founded the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and for the rest of his life made charitable gifts in Lowell's name. To these friends, Lowell now declared his ideal to be the useful citizen, a mighty, unpretending hero. And his goal for his life after the war was to look a Southern stranger in the eye. He urged his friends to set that as their goal as well. By mid-October, Early's men could no longer had forage in the Shenandoah Valley. They would have to fight soon or cede the valley to the Union. Lowell was convinced that the fate of the nation would be decided not on the battlefield, but at the ballot box. McClellan had promised to sue for peace, a peace that would preserve slavery and, from Lowell's point of view, render pointless all that his kinsmen had died for. Lincoln's re-election was paramount. On October 19, as his troops set out on a pre-dawn scout, they spotted Early's men creeping across a ford in the morning fog, then heard firing to their left. Without orders, Lowell at first waited helplessly. Then, as he realized Early's surprise attack was succeeding and that the lack of orders was not intentional, he led 2 brigades 3 miles across the battlefield as if on military parade. He drew Confederate fire onto his own men, This gave the infantry, caught unprepared in their tents or in camps and fleeing to the rear in varying degrees of panic and disorder, a chance to calm and reorganize. Reaching the main road, he finally received orders to prevent the Confederates, lodged in the village of Middletown, from continuing their pursuit of the Union infantry. Some of his men took an extreme advanced position behind stone walls and trees, providing cover for a series of charges on the well-fortified town. Meanwhile, the rest of the cavalry massed on the road outside the town, and Early's men grew timid. Arrogantly parading just out of range, the Union Cavalry presented themselves as preparing for a charge. Behind them was chaos as Union infantry officers attempted to rally their men and reform their units. While returning from one of the charges on Middletown, Lowell was first wounded. Despite a collapsed lung and internal hemorrhaging, he refused to leave the field and continued to conduct his men's delaying tactics while Sheridan rallied his infantry. Not till 4 p.m. was the signal given for the counter-assault. In recognition of his contribution and knowing that in all likelihood he was already dying, General Merritt asked Lowell to lead the charge. Strapped into his saddle, he rode to the front of the 3,000 horsemen. Immediately he gave the signal. The bugle sounded, and he took off. The cavalry followed, enveloped in deafening thunder from the horses' hooves pounding the earth. Almost instantly he was shot through the spine by the sharpshooters on the village rooftops. He fell from his horse paralyzed and was carried on a litter behind his men as they retook the village of Middletown. Through the night he dictated final letters, gave orders, and with the dawn of the next day died. The Battle of Cedar Creek became a tremendous Union victory, breaking the Confederate cavalry, destroying the strategic value of the Shenandoah Valley, and providing Lincoln with a victory just 2 weeks before his re-election. In many ways, Lowell's life is a very simple story of a young man who challenged himself to live a heroic life and then went out and lived it. He could look back on all his youthful theories of reform, of self-culture, of subtle Emersonian concepts, and recognize that war had boiled it all down and taught him that the great secret in doing is in seeing what needs to be done. But heroic action was only part of it. The moral and ethical challenges he faced along the way remind us that nothing is very simple. Initially, he had been as anxious as any to be tested in battle, but that had changed with experience. He had passed the test, but the lesson learned was not what he expected. Military leadership was not, Lowell learned, the ultimate challenge so many young men had imagined it would be. He wrote his wife, "I wish I could feel as sure of doing my duty elsewhere as I am of doing it on the field of battle." With chagrin, he confessed that he found it easier to see what needs to be done in the crisis of the battlefield than in the relative calm of civilian life. And in 1854, as he made his way across a battlefield, sending men to kill and be killed, to burn wheat fields and to execute guerillas, what sustained him was his new ideal of heroics, what he called a patriot's duty, performing the small, lackluster duties that need to be done in peacetime for peaceful living. I don't know whether anybody has a question, but I would answer it if they did. She grew up, never married, was a bit sad. They wanted to know what happened to the baby. This baby, in fact, the other baby was his daughter. This picture is a picture of Ralph Waldo Emerson with his son, Edward Waldo Emerson, who wrote the first biography of Lowell, and his son, Charles Lowell Emerson.
How much of the detail of the last battle and so forth were known here in Boston at the time or soon after?
She wants to know how much of the details of the last battle were known in Boston, or how soon they came to be known. And the answer is quite quickly, partly because it was just before an election. That victory and the death of this heroic young man were very much used to kind of rally support for the Republican vote. But that was in many ways the most. Lowell never wrote a word about what it was to be in battle. And his military career, therefore, rather like his mentor, General Buford, these were men who hated reporters and refused to let reporters travel with them. So they were very much inside men, somewhat unrecognized. Sally?
Some of your Civil War photographs, I mean, most of them I haven't seen before. They're really extraordinary. Where did you find them? Is there a family album or something?
Well, some are from all sorts of places. Some do come from the family. Some come from the Harvard University archives. Some from the Mollis collection, which is at Carlisle Barracks. Others are a bit. The Forbes family gave me some. That wonderful one.
The one of the group at Camp May.
Yes, and the poster, the recruiting poster. Others, it's a little higgledy-piggledy. Yeah.
Nice selection.
Thank you.
What has been the impact on you personally, since you are related? What have you felt?
She wants to know what the impact on me personally has been to write the book. Well, in 30 seconds or less, it's been a great adventure. I've learned a tremendous amount and did not expect to have such a good time.
So did Charles Russell Lowell and his wife have the child?
Yes.
And what came of that child?
Well, she lived with her mother in New York. Effie never remarried, wore black for the rest of her life, never remarried, and became quite a formidable figure, really the Jane Addams of New York, really crucial figure in the social service reform movement. And her daughter really never emerged from her mother's shadow. We don't really have a very clear picture of. Carlotta never married, died relatively young. We don't really get a much clearer picture of her than that. Yeah?
This incident of the torture and the killing of the Confederate, did he ever reflect on that or say anything about it? Did it change him? Or did it make him less aware, less willing to be a soldier?
Well, it's an interesting case because the Army was on the move when it happened, and therefore all his superior generals were right there. And it was really at the insistence of a guy named General Torbert, who was the cavalry commander, commander of the entire cavalry. A very close friend of his had been gunned down in a Mosby ambush situation, and he vented his rage on these prisoners. And Lowell's men were not reluctant cooperants in this. They wanted to prove, they were the ones who were sent out to catch the guys, and they caught them and brought them in. And I think Lowell was upset. I think he felt that he was caught between the rage of his superior generals and the sort of long-delayed desire for revenge of his men. And he, he didn't have a lot of room to maneuver. And I think it very much was an incident that contributed to this comment that he made about wanting to look a Southern stranger in the eye. Along with the burning, along with the fact that the cavalry now was so monumentally destructive. It may be an odd sort of distinction to make, but when victory is equivalent to destruction, it doesn't feel that good. Yeah?
Could you summarize briefly General Order 100 and who signed it?
General Order 100 was commissioned by General Halleck, who previous to the war had produced the American version of the rules of war, borrowing heavily from people like Jomini. And when he was called east, when he served in Missouri, where there was also a lot of guerrilla fighting, it became apparent to him that the brief mention by Jomini of guerrilla war, something to the effect of, a war that involves civilians is one to be avoided at all cost, was an inadequate response. And he commissioned a guy named Francis Lieber, who was a German emigre, a Republican, one of those many Europeans who lost out in the liberal uprisings of 1848 and therefore ended up in America. And Lieber wrote this code which attempted to define what a guerrilla was, how you might distinguish a guerrilla from an ordinary civilian, what the conditions for forage would be, or any form of penalizing the civilian population in which you were occupying their homes and towns. He came up with a range of classifications. You can read the document and think it sounds pretty reasonable, but there is always the caveat that, things need to be done to win a war. And therefore, the order was very much open to interpretation, was used to justify, for instance, the burning of the town of Darien in South Carolina, which was an incident that many people found highly objectionable. It was signed by, I assume, the Secretary of War in the way that all general orders would have been.
What happened to Mosby?
Mosby? He survived the war, refused to surrender. Like many Confederate generals, went into a pretty low period in the decade or 20 years following the war. But he was William Hathaway Forbes, after the war, really searched Mosby out. They had had quite an extraordinary encounter in which Forbes had almost killed Mosby, but failed to do so, and in failing to do so was taken prisoner himself and had a horrible prison experience. But it was an event that led Forbes to later in the war find Mosby and connect with him, and then to find him a sinecure under Grant. And at that point, Mosby became a Republican of all things, horrifying most of the men who had served under him and those for whom he remained, one of those lost hopes that the Confederate sympathizers like so much. And so this pariah status meant that he eventually, I think, ended up in Singapore serving in some federal capacity for a while until things calmed down. And then I think he had a job in the post office and lived to be almost 100 years old or something like that. He was a very tough old guy. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Did Jeb Stuart and his cavalry play any role in this battle?
Well, Jeb Stuart, yes, in an odd sort of way. The first encounter was on the peninsula when Lowell was able to spot Stuart as he began his ride around the Union Cavalry, and so Lowell was trailing behind, trying to catch up. And the fellow who thought of that clever idea was Mosby. And Mosby was a protege of Stuart's, and it was from that raid that Mosby's idea of forming this guerrilla band and harassing the rear of the Union Army came. And then just before the Battle of Gettysburg, Lowell was desperate to get in on the real fight and managed to wangle his way into Hooker's headquarters and to get an order sending him off, and off they all went. And this was, in fact, the night that Hooker was relieved of command, and so conflicting orders chased Lowell as he ran away from this horrible assignment with Mosby and thought he was heading out into the glorious real battles. And in this gap, a real gap, fords that were left unguarded, Jeb Stuart took off and began his second ride around the Union Army. The irony of which was that Lowell was convinced he would be cashiered for this and that he would end up taking the blame. Fortunately, Hooker took the blame and was cashiered instead. But of course, it would have been so much better for the Confederates if Lowell had stayed at that ford and Stuart had not gone off on that ride. So it was a kind of fortuitous event.
Did they engage each other?
No, never. No. Lowell was always a few miles. Yes?
Yes, Carol, excuse me. I just wanted to ask you, please, was Charles Russell Lowell the grandson of the Reverend Charles Lowell?
Yes, he was.
And I'm just, he must have been another brother than James Russell Lowell. Was there another brother?
Sorry, ask that again.
Was he descended from a brother?
Yes, yes. James Russell Lowell, there were three sons in that family. James Russell Lowell was the youngest. The oldest was Charles Russell Lowell, Sr.
Okay, I'm just interested. In fact, I might be interested when my father purchased 51 Chestnut Street.
Oh, yes.
He didn't realize, he bought it basically because we needed a rollover. But he was very interested to see on the deed that the Reverend Charles Lowell, that was the first occupant of that house.
Yes.
The poet James Russell Lowell was born there, so Charles Russell Lowell's father must have been
Yes.
born there too.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Very interesting.
So we got it. There's still quite a lot of the old architecture, old copper basins, that type of thing.
Oh, great.
So,
Great.
thank you for such an interesting talk. Just an absolute amazing panoply of figures.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay.
I'm curious to know more about his working relationship with Sheridan and Custer and his impressions of them if you recorded.
This is a question that asks for Lowell's working relationships with Custer and Sheridan. He felt very differently about the two men. He was a great admirer of Sheridan. He said that Sheridan worked like a mill owner, meaning that he felt everything was at stake, and he was going to make sure whatever it took, he would do it and make sure it happened. He was not, as so many earlier Union officers were, worried about offending people. If he thought somebody wasn't performing, he really came down on them and let them know. And I think Lowell found that refreshing. Custer, he did not like. He considered him a showman. And there is one very amusing exchange after the Battle of Tom's Brooks, I think it is, when Custer, or maybe it was Winchester, Custer is bragging at all the booty that he captured battle flags, meaning they had overrun regiments and taken the regimental battle flags. Lowell had been the guy who, when they were charging, the charge was halted by an artillery position that the Confederates had, and Lowell's men charged that and took those guns. And Lowell, after listening, Custer started teasing Lowell and saying, how come you don't have more flags and all this stuff? And Lowell said to him, well, why don't you take some artillery? Flags don't kill people. Yeah.
I wondered if you had read Colonel Charles Russell Lowell and Theodore Roosevelt and Henry Cabot Lodge's book, Hero Tale from American History, and to what extent was he used as an ideal type by that next generation of progressive?
To a large extent. I think that forts were named after him, children were named after him, homes in his speeches as Memorial Day was established constantly referred to him. Among his contemporaries, he was continued to be held up as a yardstick, that he had set a kind of standard that everything else could be measured against. And I can remember early in my research going to interview Dr. George Sturgis, who was a descendant, and asking him what it had been like as a child growing up, what he had known of Charlie Lowell, and he said to me, "Oh, they were like gods to us." So I think that was very much a part of the experience. Yeah.
On that same point, you mentioned Henry Lee Higginson, who was Lowell's great friend and admirer, and I think served with him actually in research. What else did Higginson do after the war in commemoration of the lives of Lowell and also his other classmates who he killed?
Well, the biggest thing is Soldiers Field, which you may know about. But that whole bit of real estate over there by the football stadium was given by Higginson to Harvard in memory of Lowell and Stephen Perkins, James Jackson Lowell, and Edward Dalton, who was a surgeon who had saved a lot of limbs. Higginson had put up a lot of the money behind Memorial Hall. One of the most charming things he did, Higginson, let's see, I'm not quite sure, I'm sure many in the audience can correct me when precisely Emerson's house burned. would have been later in the 1880s. And one of the gifts that was given of money to rebuild that house was in the name of Charles Russell Lowell, and that was Henry Higginson at work. There were countless, and Higginson felt he clearly felt very. Higginson was not a great officer. He was not really a great soldier, but he was a great guy. And many better men had died, and I think that weighed on Higginson's mind. And he was also very profoundly dyslexic, and so he learned by talking, and he felt that everything he had learned from Charlie Lowell. So his sense of indebtedness was huge.
You spoke of the daily letters. Were they preserved? Were they part of your research? Were a lot of the letters that he wrote home still available to you?
There were transcripts of everything. The search for the original letters is a long story, which I'll tell you another time. But yeah, everything had been transcribed, and we had those.
One of the things your work is wonderful. But I've always sort of been profoundly inspired and, I guess, shaped what I think is egotistically, I'd say it's a uniquely Yankee or New England feature of Lowell and perhaps even the family a few generations back, sort of revitalizing the idea of ultimately returning to serve your community and the neighborhood or whatever. Would you say that's a Lowell feature of the family, starting with his grandfather?
Well, I think one of the things that is worth considering in that question is that many of these families grew out of mercantile families. They had businesses that sailed all over the world, and they were family-owned businesses. And as you came up through the ranks, you did your time, either aboard ship or as an agent in Whampoa or Canton or Calcutta or wherever. And you were, in other words, a corporate being from the very beginning. Probably in the way that, for instance, farm life might do that too. So that I think that raises interesting questions about how much these guys were able to think of themselves as independent entities and how much they thought of themselves as part of a larger whole. Lowell, in his writing letters, is constantly talking to his friends about how they will complete him, how in the club there'll be this guy and this guy and this guy, and each person has their different virtue that they bring to make a larger whole. This is a theme that he returns to again and again. So he was really an expert at seeing how he could work within a group, how people could combine to reinforce each other with different skills. And I think that was how he thought. Kurt.
Where did he grow up and go to school? He was a little younger than when the home.
Older.
When they went to school, was not a place?
Well, Lowell his mother was a school teacher. After his father went bankrupt, his mother supported them by going to school, running a school. And so Lowell went to that school. Then he went to the Boston Latin School and whizzed through that, won all their prizes, and was still far too young for Harvard. So he went to something called the English High School, which was essentially a kind of vocational school in the same building. And only when he got done with that did he then go to Harvard. think maybe I'm going to take one more question. Yeah?
You talked a little bit about how he talked about what he was going to do after the war. What was that?
Well, he didn't know for sure. He had commissioned Effie to figure that out for him. He also told Henry Lee Higginson to figure it out, too. He was going to rebuild the country, but quite what that amounted to. Some of his friends went down, bought plantations, tried to grow cotton, tried to teach and educate. His sister set up a school for ex-slaves in Washington. There was a number of the guys he was the mentor to work for the Freedmen's Bureau, which again was another one of these organizations that attempted to rectify 100 years of bondage. So there was a hell of a lot of work to be done, and I think he was only just beginning to think about what it would be. Well, thank you.